Welcome to Sunday Night on Asase 99.5 in Accra, 98.5 in Kumasi, 100.3 in Cape Coast, and 99.7 in Tamale. Also on affiliates across Ghana and streaming globally on Facebook, as well as later on YouTube at our page Asase XTRA, Asase Extra. And today we've come to a leafy corner of Accra and a quiet garden, or we hope it'll remain quiet, to talk to somebody who has Africa on his mind. We're the guests of Onyekachi Wambu. Onyekachi Wambu is a writer, editor, journalist, and a film producer with a reputation for popular scholarship, Africa-related activism, and questioning the status quo. Born in Nigeria, he moved after the Civil War from there to the UK, where he studied at the famously left-wing University of Essex and then at the famously old guard and conservative University of Cambridge. His publications include A Fuller Picture, Under the Tree of Talking, Leadership in the African Context, and a new edition of the classic anthology that he edited 25 years ago, newly republished in a 75th anniversary edition by Weidenfeld and Nicholson, the book being Empire Windrush, Reflections of 75 Years and More. He's a former editor of The Voice newspaper in the UK, pioneering Black interest publication. His documentaries and research collaborations for the BBC and for Channel 4 in the UK, as well as PBS in the United States, include Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, Africa Out of Darkness, Deadly Bliss, and the series based around a 2-hour documentary, Hopes on the Horizon, a documentary about Africa in the 1990s as it turned the corner from the era of military coups and dictatorships to one of democratic experiment. He is the Director of Special Projects at the African Foundation for Development, known for short as AFFORD in the UK, a diasporan organization dedicated to harnessing the powers of the African diaspora for the good of the African continent. And he's our guest here on Sunday Night, Onyekachi Wambu.
Well, I was last year in 2019 for the year of return. Accra was a party town. The offer to the diaspora, the historic diaspora, to come back home was taken up. And from the figures that have been received, it was extremely successful. I think they were anticipating perhaps 400 to a million visitors, to 500,000 visitors. And it turned out that about 1.5 million people came. So a huge success. And then the figures from the Ministry of Finance was that those 500,000 people had spent an additional $1.8 billion into the economy. So, after 30, 40 years of trying to establish a tourism industry overnight with an offer to the diaspora, but it looks like, that's been built up again with that heritage offer to the diaspora to come back. And not just Ghana now, but all the countries along the coast have seen the success of that, and they're now also trying to put together offers to the diaspora as well.
The motherland is at the heart of many of the debates about restitution, reparations for wrongs done in the era of enslavement, and questions of cultural justice, particularly to do with North-South relations. Now, you have a long and storied career in filmmaking, where some of these questions have been very much topmost in your mind in relation to the position of Black people, particularly African people living in the diaspora. The new edition of your book, Empire Windrush, newly out for this year, because this year, of course, was the 75th anniversary of the arrival of that famous boat, Lord Kitchener on board, and others docking at Tilbury, and going on to change the face of England as we saw it. Thinking of the Empire Windrush generation, are we now at a point where the idea of a Black Britain, with which you are well familiar, which you are part of shaping, is now both African and Caribbean?
That's a powerful question. And in a way, I try to address it in the Empire Windrush book. And the Empire Windrush is 75 years, reflections of 75 years and more of the Black British presence in the UK. So we're looking at a lot of other ships that have come and gone. Something happens in 48, and it's important to understand what happens in 48, but 48 is a moment, and there are lots of other moments. And so what I wanted to do was to address that African presence in its totality, rather than saying African Caribbean, African continental. There's been this, what I'm calling the African Atlantic. I'm now calling it the African Atlantic. We've spent the last 400 years discussing the Euro-Atlantic, but Africans have been very important in shaping that Atlantic space over the last 500 years. Our free labor, our contributions culturally, and all the things that we have done, our resources. Without uranium, France powers 80% of its resources, its energy from Niger. So without Niger's uranium, France is diminished. So there's this role that nobody wants to talk about, part of this Atlantic space. And what I'm trying to do in the book is to put it again at the center of the discourse. And to say, yes, 48 happens, but before 48, Aquina arrives in another ship in the 18th century. He leaves a testimony, so that his testimony is in the book. Mary Prince arrives, Phyllis Wheatley arrives, and Phyllis Wheatley arrives at a point where the UK still owned the Americas. So it was one intellectual space, and then of course they got independence and have gone off, but we're still kind of discussing it because that's an Atlantic space, and the domination or the hegemony moves from Europe in the Atlantic space since the post-war period to America, and we're now at another big pivotal shift. And the shift that we're in is that ironically, the Atlantic space itself is declining. In 1985, up until 1985, the most important trade route in the world was from Europe across to the Americas. From 1985 onwards, the biggest trade route in the world was across the Pacific, from China to the Americas. And we are now estimating that from 2030, the biggest trade route in the world will be within Asia. So these two areas, the Pacific and the Atlantic, are in decline. And there's as you can see, with everything that's going on with the coups, anxiety of France in Ukraine, there's a massive global renegotiation going on with the BRICS and everything else. So I wanted to understand what we are doing today in that Windrush moment in terms of that broader context. And it's more than just saying Black Britain.
Indeed. And looking at that subject, what would you say the role is of the new black classes, whether they class themselves as black and British, whether they're people who have tried to do the thing of returning to the motherland, done the return and settled back here in a country such as Ghana or even in Nigeria. Where does Africa fit into that jigsaw?
I mean, the first thing is there's been a lot of talk about the Black Atlantic in the past, Paul Gilroy and other. I don't find that very useful. And so the reason I'm talking about the African Atlantic is, let's call it what it was. On the tour for the book, I met somebody, he's a mixed race guy, probably brought up by his mother, so very little contact with his Caribbean family and
His white mother.
his white mother. And so he goes off to do a DNA test to find out. So he's expecting the Irish-Scottish connection, and he sees all of that there. And then on this side, he expects to see Jamaica, and then but he sees Ghana and Nigeria. And he's saying, well, what's that got to do with me? I'm Jamaican. And I had to remind him that the Jamaicans are dead. Yeah? They were genocided. The people who are in those islands are Africans who are in Jamaica, and that's why his DNA is coming up as Ghanaian and Nigerian. So that conversation of that we're inventing people in these spaces, I just don't find useful. It's an African Atlantic space, different with Africans in different locations doing different things. The African Haitians were doing what they were doing in 1804. On the continent, the Sokoto Caliphate was doing what it was doing in 1804, but we need to also understand it as one space. And the consequences of the Sokoto Caliphate meant there was more movement, to the Americas as a result of the upheavals that happened. The Yoruba civil wars, every time that happened, people got transported to Brazil and elsewhere. So we cannot keep talking about this stuff like it's siloed. It's not. It's one civilizational space. Different locations, different particularities and sensitivities, and we must take that into account. But it's one civilizational space.
I suppose where some cultural critics or theorists here might resist that idea is it seems to deny the specificity of their experience or the people with whom they feel the greatest link. But I wondered what you thought about the agency of Africans within that space, because in a way, as you say, it's a space that is remaking itself, not only because of the shift of the balance of world power, but you have had historically, yes, the enslavement and the transportation of millions of people in the Middle Passage to the Caribbean and the North Americas, some even ending up in England even before the peak of the slave trade, or the European countries, Northern European countries before the peak of the slave trade. But you have also had waves of return. You've had the emancipados moving from Brazil and populating the Gulf of Guinea, setting up their own particular communities, bringing with them their own particular culture, even their own particular architecture. We are now going through a moment where larger numbers of people than perhaps we've experienced in the recent past are thinking quite seriously of the idea of return to the motherland, not as a romantic concept, but very much as the emancipados, as an economic investment, taking their skills that they have acquired and the capital they've built up in the required and returning it to Africa, wherever that might be. Is that what you see as a sign of a stagnant argument, or do you think the new return is taking a new form?
Well, I think it's like, I don't want to be, go and say it's stagnant, but I do think it doesn't take into account some of the profound things that are happening. So I've never said that each location didn't have a specific thing to offer. I mean, that's a given, and we need to respect that. What the Africans in Jamaica went through was an experience that only they went through, and we need to understand that. but they are also part of a larger African world, and we can learn and share, and that's what is so rich at the moment, that cross-cultural sharing is going on. Somebody said to me, what was the most important thing that happened as a result of Windrush? And I said, actually, for me, it wasn't all these people going to the UK. It was that on a popular level, myself and ordinary people from the Caribbean, ordinary people from the continent, and ordinary people from the Caribbean met again. Yes? The intellectuals always met and talked in their Pan-African conferences, but we met on a popular level. And that's the stuff that you're talking about now, the ferment of people coming back and seeing possibilities, is because that meeting has happened after 400-year Gulf, and we're learning about it. You know, the last 50, 60 years in the UK was me just learning about what happened to all these people who left. When I came from Nigeria, we weren't taught about them. And then you come there and you're like, okay, who are you, Jamaica? What does that mean? What does being on that island or on that rock for 400 years mean? You're African American. What does that mean? And then you see the cultural explosions from them. You see reggae. You see the things that they create, and it's kind of magnificent. And around '94, I started an African Remembrance Day, and the reason I did that was that on that journey, I mean, my filmmaking, the voice, all of that is been about trying to understand what happened in those 400 years, and how did people change? How did I change as an Igbo person in the Nigerian context? You mentioned that I left after the Civil War. The Civil War kind of breaks the Igbo world. So you're trying to see how all these pieces fit together. And then the Remembrance Day happened because I read an August Wilson play, Joe Turner's Come and Gone, and there's a character in the middle of it who evokes this scene, and the scene just, it's just an amazing scene where he's in a trance and he's going through a bit of madness, but he channels these voices and has a vision of people walking out of the Atlantic Ocean and skeletons, and then they walk onto the eastern seaboard of the Americas, and when they walk onto the beach, they take on flesh. And it was the moment I knew statistically that the Atlantic was an African graveyard, but it was just statistics. I didn't understand that emotionally, and that was the breakthrough. And once you understand that there are millions of, this Atlantic, it's an African graveyard, and if you can't claim the space, having paid the price in blood and treasure, what are we talking about? So this is the African Atlantic. Is, can we claim this space and our role in what has made it prosperous, but also to acknowledge the pain that and the price that we've paid in this space. And then the really important thing is the reconnection of that African world that was shattered for 500 years, and how do we remake that? And for me, that's what all this is about. And you said about the Ghana Year of Return, it's been in gestation. I've known that it's been in gestation since at least 2000, because we were talking to Panifest, and they were starting that work then. And then Rawlins in, I think it was 98, he does the Remembrance Day on August the 1st. We'd already been doing it in the UK on August the 1st since 95. So you can see all this stuff is knitting together. And then after Panifest, the next initiative was a Joseph project.
That's right.
And so we've seen it. And so by 2019, the moment happens, it can explode. And then 2020, Black Lives Matter has now, that Atlantic world erupted. We saw it in the Americas, in the UK, in France. The statues came down, and we're like, okay, everybody on a popular level now is saying, what happened? How do we remake ourselves? And I've come up with these 10 R's, I call it. to understand the moment or that period. So obviously the first hour is not included, but the first hour is resistance, where every time all this stuff was happening, we resisted. But then, once we were defeated to a certain extent, then the other R's kicked in, and those are the ones that all of us are trying to work within different movements. So there's the R of recognition. We're still trying to get the other side to recognize that millions of us died. They won't even acknowledge it or atone or say sorry. And from recognition, you move to remembrance. Are we remembering all the victims ourselves? And then from remembrance, you go to restitution. Our artworks were taken, our, sometimes ancestral remains. So how do we get all of that back? And then restitution, you go to reparations, how we repaid the damage that was done, how do we holistically engage with the other side. So quite a few of these are about us and them. And then another 4 or 5 are about us and how we kind of rebuild. So that, or us and us. So there's kind of return and reconnection. The Rastas have tried to return for years, yeah, and they went to Shashamani, and so there are examples of that. And then there's this very difficult work around reconnecting and the pain on all the sides. But the idea is that you end with the 10th one with, what the AU are asking for, how we rebuild our societies and reconstruct our societies. And then you end with what the AU wants in 2063, which is a renaissance of some kind. So all of this, for me, is happening within that framework. And different people are fighting different battles, and we all choose our ground. For a long time, I was just concerned about remembrance. And now I'm looking at restitution and trying to get the artworks back. The Rastas have only been connected with the return. Others on the continent have been connected with reconstruction and how we rebuild these societies. We've been performing quite badly in that respect, but Nkrumah and others had those big visions about how you do that. So yeah, it's been a big agenda, and all of us can find something inside of that to work on. And some people are just spend all their time trying to convince the Europeans to say sorry and to acknowledge what has happened.
Well, in a way, that brings me very much to what I wanted to ask you about restoration, reparations, and restitution. The subject of the AHRM, the Africa Heritage Restitution Movement Summit that you've been attending at the W.B. Du Bois Center. How much of the importance of the emphasis of restitution is about symbolic things or cultural objects, and how much is to do with the idea of a restitution that takes perhaps a more Holocaust-shaped model, which is about this is what you did to 6 million people, and the 6 million people you killed and the people you destroyed, and we demand payment to rebuild our societies from a financial point of view. What is the element of economics, or the role that economics and cold hard cash restitution, particularly by Western countries that benefited from the slave trade, what element does that play?
A lot of people are working on that, and people are very passionate about that. CARICOM have a 10-point, I think it's a 10-point, or is it a 14-point? Anyway, they have a reparations document that they've produced and done a lot of intensive work. They've got economists who are even trying to work out how you might cost that. And there was somebody, I think last week, who worked out $13 trillion. The British were highly dismissive of it, but there are a lot of people doing some important work in that sphere. As I said, I've been focused on remembrance and now restitution, and the restitution is because of the cultural. It's this area of culture. I try and put together books and other things. 'Cause I'm interested in culture, and I'm interested in the role of culture in moving people forward. And I think if you get the culture right, then people move. And economics is vital, but I think culture has a role. And Cabral talked about the role of culture in the liberation struggle, and I kind of agree with him in how it provides the momentum for activism. So I'm interested in that, and you look at what do these items that we're taking represent? It's the culture of the people, the highest culture of the people. Sometimes you look at the gold pieces that were taken during the sacking of the punitive expedition in Ashanti Plan. You know, wonderful works of art. So you look at that. There's a whole kind of aesthetic considerations. Who were the artists? Who put this together? What was the economic setup? Because to produce that level of art, somebody's sponsoring it. We know in Venice it was,
The Medici.
the Medici family. So who's sponsoring this? And how do you create an ecosystem to reproduce art to that level? Or and then you have what the pieces themselves represent in terms of the stories that they tell and they allow you to understand. And then the technology that is involved and that would have been mastered at a particular time to allow all of that. So all of this comes together and you're like, okay, you look at what's being produced today and it's not of that quality. So is there something we can learn by having our artists re-engage with this? Can they re-engage with it in the UK when they can't get a visa to go to the UK to get in? So these are the big questions why it belongs here. I spoke to you in 2019. We all came here, a group of us, people from the Caribbean and others, and we go to the castles in Cape Coast and Elmina, and it's a horrible experience. And then you come out and you're like, well, what was Ghana like before this? You go to the local museum and all the best stuff is in Europe. So even if you're going to do the tourism offer, you need it so that people can get a sense of this civilization or what was here before the tragedy. So you have your Sankofa symbol. You can't go forward without taking to go back. So yeah, for me, the culture and the items and our program's called Return of the Icons. They are icons. I mean, icons has a religious significance in some cultures, in the Orthodox and other cultures, and some Christian traditions. But the icons are not just the artifacts; they're also the human remains. Trophies were taken when, I think you've just had one human remain returned here to Ghana from the Netherlands, where people who resisted had their heads cut off and were taken, and now they're largely in boxes in the basements of museums. So for our own dignity, we need to get those heroes back and put them. The Zimbabweans want 4 of the heroes from the late 19th century who resisted in the first war of liberation against Cecil Rhodes and his lot. And they were executed, heads cut off, and they're somewhere, I think, in the Natural History Museum in a basement. And the Zimbabweans want them back so that they can bury them in Heroes Acre, and they've got the places they want to bury their heroes. So all of this is, and then the one that really upsets me now, you go to the British Museum, and there's a floor of high-ranking African officials who are on display. And people come in on a Sunday afternoon with their families and they're taking selfies with these mummified high-ranking Egyptian officials. Why are you displaying human remains? And why do we tolerate it as Africans? So a lot of questions come out of this work, and this is also about our own sense of our dignity and what we think our dignity is about.
Talking about restitution of cultural artifacts, uh, there's a sense perhaps in Ghana that I think less so in the case of Nigeria, which has always been, at the sharp edge of these debates and had, if you like, a far greater body of work. For example, the Benin bronzes famously looted in the beginning of the 20th century. Scattered in private collections as well as national collections in the UK in particular, but not exclusively so, again, permeated across the Western world. But a sense of Ghana having come to the table about restitution, to discuss restitution of cultural artifacts in particular, rather late, and specifically in relation to the gold artifacts you mentioned from Asante-Man looted during the Anglo-Asante Wars from the end of the 19th century into the beginning of the 20th. Aside from looking back and crying over spilt milk about whether it's the time or the moment to do it or not, what particular levers of influence do you think that Africa can begin, or African peoples can use to begin to bear in seeking the restoration of these things, whether they're human remains, whether they're cultural artifacts,
Or
that
money.
aren't purely to do with the moral argument about history? Because the counter argument in the countries where they have ended up is that it's merely an accident of history, and they have now become the legal custodians of what they present as world heritage. And so something that shouldn't be limited to Africa, but in a small institution in a country like this, where it's more difficult to travel than to London or Washington, D.C.
Yeah, but why would people ever come here if the best is always in London? So I mean, it's just facetious arguments. They've lost the argument anyway. So the stuff will come back. Where it's going to take time. It could be 20, 30 years, but the moral argument's gone. In the conversations, people just find it very difficult defending, and the arguments that are put up to defend holding on to this stuff is specious. The last one was that, oh, well, if it comes to Africa, it will be lost and we can protect it. And then 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago, there's a curator for the classical stuff in the British Museum who's been busily selling off all the Greek stuff. So, that argument's gone as well, so it's not just the applicants who sell stuff on the side. This is, and anyway, if you get your stuff back and Ashanti gets his patrimony back and his heirlooms back, he can sell it to whoever he wants to. It's his, and he can define what a World Heritage Museum looks like. We can do that as well. Most of this stuff wasn't created for museums anyway, so we have work to define how we reuse it, and there's a big conversation. I'm also partly just excited about this stuff because once the stuff comes back, we have to then work out why we want it, and that's a big one for us in terms of, and sometimes in all those conversations it's difficult. The Benin Empire was an empire, so it got this stuff from other people who were subjugated, and they might have attitudes. So history comes alive again, and we have these conversations amongst ourselves as we seek to reconstruct our societies. But I don't think Ghana's come in late to the game. I think something happened, and this is really important. People say, why now? Why is all this happening? In 1994, 95, before we launched the Remembrance Day, I knew all of this was going to happen. And why did we know? Because a number of things were happening between 1990 and 94. that showed me that something was in the air. So the AU launched a reparations committee, an eminent persons group of reparations in 92 with Abiola in 93. There was Abuja and Lagos plan of action. So something big happened there. Bernie Grant went to that conference, comes back and launches the African reparations movement in the UK. We launched African Remembrance Day shortly after. So why is all this happening at that moment between 1990 and 94? And thinking about it, I figured out that what happens is that for 400 years or so, there's been an age in that African Atlantic world where African inferiority has been codified. Yeah. And what we've been really focused on during that period of codification, from Haiti to the American wars, or for civil rights, to abolish slavery, the decolonial struggles, all of this has been about moving from one location in that Atlantic space to another to remove this indignity, this codification of our inferiority in laws. And the last time that happens is 94 in South Africa. So if you understand it as an age, we're at the end of that age. And so what happens in 94 is that we are now looking back at the price that we paid in all those struggles, because before we were only looking forward to remove them. And so we're now looking back at who died, what was taken, what did they take from us in terms of money, and that the accounting is happening.
The reckoning.
And the reckoning. And each of us will come to that at different points. So a lot of the young people, it was Black Lives Matter. But there is no doubt, and that's why I'm saying we're going to get this stuff back, because the movement is there in all those different 10 areas, and it will be a movement because people will wake up and come to a new realization, and they wouldn't think it was important. I didn't think it was important. And then I thought, oh my God, the least estimate is 2 million people at the bottom of the Atlantic. That's the least. And the most could be, I don't know, 10, 15. And then the people who died on the plantations, the people who died on the continent when they're being captured. I mean, and then I said to myself, well, we lose that many people and we carry on like nothing happened. What kind of people are we? And once you ask that question, then you owe something to those ancestors, and that their lives meant something. That we can today walk across them bones to reconnect with our people who are in the Americas. And the Negro spiritual, they talked about them bones, dry bones, and so they were never forgotten. And I think it's important work, and we need to focus on it.
Leaving aside the contrary argument about the inevitable effects of empire and imperial expansion across the world in eras past, even back to the Greeks and the Romans and the history of the British or French or Portuguese empires, you raise the question of South Africa and that being the last frontier in terms of realizing the indignity done to you by
codification. That was important. And the indignity continues, but they haven't had the power to put it in, since South Africa, to put it in a legal document. That's what's different.
So the end of the era of past laws and the kind of racial classification, but still very much, for example, in the South African context, and people might argue even in a city like Accra, a central question of land and the ownership of land. In a country like Ghana, the sense that the lands are vested in the state, and you find communities and individuals fighting for restitution of their rights, either as cultural groups or as people wanting to better their environment, reclaim their environment In South Africa, the land question and the economic question persisting in the sense that the ownership of the heights of the economy and the structures of that pretty much hasn't changed since 1994. Now, one of the things that has brought you to Accra is precisely that question of land, and specifically how you live and how you make a home on the land. Can you tell us a little bit about the idea behind what Afford is trying to do in partnership with countries on the African continent to do with land and housing?
Well, Afford's mission is to enhance the contributions the diaspora make to Africa's development and enhance and expand the contributions. So we've been looking at ways, and we think the diaspora has 5 forms of capital that it deploys at home. Financial capital, the remittance economy is probably worth 100 billion and more across Africa. Then skills, knowledge, so intellectual capital, political capital, our ability to advocate for change and policy changes, and then cultural capital that I've just talked about in terms of, the diaspora is a big market for cultural products, so food, music, you name it, from the continent. And then social capital. So we've been trying to see how we can bring all those together to, we're already doing a lot. As I said, that remittance economy is it's 100 million. But it's not necessarily having the impact that it should have because it's peer-to-peer largely. So we're saying to people, one of the big things that they all invest in is housing. So yeah, you can spend a lifetime trying to build a house, which we probably don't do because your relatives do whatever they do. Or you can do that and then invest £1,000 in an instrument that builds affordable housing that has a social impact. So that's what we are beginning to explore, how we get, like for 40 years, Ghana was spending time trying to get European tourists to come to Ghana, and then it now discovers this 1.5 million heritage tourism market. Can we also discover a diaspora investment market and invest in strategic parts of the economy? So it could be housing, it could be other areas. So we want to start with housing. There's a big need. Urbanization is happening at an incredible pace in Accra. People are priced out of housing. So the market at the moment isn't responding to affordability in the marketplace. It doesn't in the UK either, because once you have high land prices and everything else, it's very hard to build affordable units. So, but there's got to be a way, that key workers and others can have access to, to housing. We understand here, because it's so pricey, that people rent, and even when they're renting, they have one house, and then there's like a tenement situation they share. Why can we not try and see if we can, create different kinds of 1, 2-bedroom or 3-bedroom houses that people can afford? And so we're trying to see if it's a difficult conundrum to crack, but we're up for it. So that's what we're trying to see if we can do. And because we're not, as a not-for-profit, we have to make enough of a return to keep doing it, but we're not there to maximize our return.
But you're not looking to operate at a loss either.
No, it has to be sustainable. But then there are others who just you have a patch of land and then you want to put a luxury apartment in it because you want to maximize your return. We might be driven by other priorities, which is actually, can we have an impact on key workers? Because, as we discovered during the pandemic, these people are the ones who keep societies going. It's not the investment bankers. It was the guys who were running the transport system, the policemen, the nurses. Can we provide something for them rather than them being priced out of everything or having to go and live, 50 miles afterwards and then spend all their income on transport costs coming into work? I mean, why?
So you have an idea at Afford of something that's very pragmatic and hands-on and can benefit both sides, both ends of that Black Atlantic in this case,
Absolutely.
people living in the diaspora who don't necessarily intend to return to the motherland, and people in the motherland, and come up with a win-win situation.
Yeah.
I
So the
want-
diaspora will get a return on investment. It may not be market rate because all of us have this philanthropic edge that we want to help. But again, like them, they don't want to lose money. So if they can make money and it's not, you know, what you guys offer here in the banks, 25, 27%, I mean, how do you do it?
I don't know how people who borrow from the banks do.
So, you know, if there may be a percentage that we can come in that is a lot less than that, but allows people some movement. So, yeah.
I think the answer to the bank's question off camera is that the only people who borrow from the banks are people who have very quick turnover of their capital. And
Yeah.
that's why so much of the Ghanaian economy is about buy quick, sell, buy quick, sell. And people want to scrabble and get their money back again.
So you can't do industrialization.
You can't do industrialization.
Yeah,
You can't do anything productive.
Yeah, it's anyway. Those are bigger questions beyond our pay grade. But anyway.
But I wondered, in attending the AHRM summit at the W.E.B. Du Bois Center, what other ideas you heard from speakers at that event that gave you assurance of a sense of having gone beyond what you described as the discussion of the Black Atlantic?
Well, I think there's a big interest in our history and culture again. There are loads of museums going up everywhere. There's one now. I was speaking to Professor Koja Yankee last night. We had dinner, and he's building the Pan-African Heritage Museum there in Winneba, you know. In Dakar, they just built the Museum of African Civilizations or Black Civilizations. Cairo are revamping all their museums of Egyptian civilization. In Benin Republic, 4 museums are going up. Yeah, they were at the conference talking about their museums. One for a military museum in Abomi, another a remembrance museum in Ouidah. In Cotonou, it'd be a museum for modern art. And then in Porto Novo, a museum of African religion. You know, in Benin, it will be voodoo. So everybody's like, whoa, okay. And for them, you spread the museums around, the different offers, people come in and they go around and, you know, they have something to see in the country. Benin are now building a museum to house the Benin, historical Benin, not political Benin, are now building a museum to house the Benin bronzes when they return. So, and all across Africa, there's this renewal that is going on. I can talk about some of the other countries in Kenya, and all of this is happening across the continent. So, and then each of us is now thinking, how do you make this sustainable? How do you link it to livelihoods? How do you make sure that people, because in the end, the young people won't protect the culture if they can't benefit materially from it. So it has to make sense in a model where there's a livelihood.
How problematic is the element of that, if you like, renewed focus on cultural artifacts when those cultural artifacts are the product of colonial history themselves? So not necessarily, say, the Asafa flags, which show white settlers arriving in Fantiland sometime in the 15th or 16th century. But particularly in the case of Ghana, we're renowned for our forts and castles. We've got more of them than any other country on the Gulf of Guinea. Many of them are in a ruinous state. And for some, there's a kind of wholesale, understandable revulsion and rejection of them. We've had an intense debate here about where our seat of government should be. It having been previously in Christiansborg, which of course was a Swedish, Danish, English slave fort, and set up as a center of commerce in people. and eventually we managed to move out, but it took us a good few years, and there were all sorts of debates that attended that. And today, as you say, a lot of the tourism that is into the country does want to confront that encounter of the place where my ancestors left through the door of no return. And never saw these shores again, but I maybe am making some kind of restitution by coming back to them. Is it problematic that African peoples today remain, in a way, trapped in repeated examination through some cultural artifacts of a period of trauma in their history, and for some of them don't seem to be able to move beyond it?
Well, we have to deal with the trauma, and the only way you deal with it is to confront it. I mean, and even the programs for addicts is, the first thing you do when you deal with the AA system is just say, I'm an alcoholic, So you have to say, I'm traumatized, and then work out how you get beyond that. So I don't have a problem with that process, and it needs to happen. And each of us goes through it at a different time. When I made my discovery, and I've seen other people who come to Remembrance Day on that journey, I was very angry in the 80s when I read this August Wilson play. And then, you focus on other things. And now I'm very much future focused, but I'm future focused in how do we use this material to move forward. Yeah. And that's where I think the discussion is heading, and I think that's useful. But we have to have those conversations because they are the heart of a lot of what is going on the continent. And if we don't have them, especially the conversation about slavery and status, some people find slavery very difficult, so I'm calling it status. Let's have a conversation about status. We still have the boy syndrome, yeah, where they're domestics, and that's something that is hangover. Is it? I don't know, but we need to discuss all of that. And these things haunt the continent, and until we relationship between different ethnic groups and who thinks they're on top and who thinks they're not, and these are the things that create our civil wars and our kind of dysfunctional politics. I was in Zanzibar, the Hopes on the Horizon. There's a film festival there called the Dow Film Festival, and my documentary was in competition. So I go to Zanzibar, Paradise Island. It was brilliant, lovely place, to attend this film festival. So I'm having the time of my life. But every time I go everywhere, people who are blacker than, and I'm going to be pejorative, but who are blacker than my ass, are telling me that they're Arabs and Persians. So I have a week of this, and I'm puzzled. I think I know the answer, but I'm puzzled. Eventually, by my hotel, there was a store, a kiosk, where this old Zanzibari guy was selling, and he was sitting outside where he always sat. And so I had been saying hello to him, and then we got into a conversation. He said, "Sit down." So we ordered some beer, and I think as a good Muslim, he shouldn't have been drinking. But anyway, we had a good. And so we started to have the conversation, and he was very well informed. Those South African guys, they listen to World Service, they read all the papers. So he was asking me stuff about America, UK, and everything else, and we were having this conversation. So I said to him, by the way, why did these people on this island keep saying that they're Persians and Arabs? Oh, he said, don't mind them. You see, the problem was that all the people who worked on the plantations here, and remember there was a plantation in Zanzibar that was run by the Arabs and the Omanis and others. All the people who were brought from the mainland. So if they tell you that they're from the mainland, they're telling you they were slaves or descendants of slaves, and no one's going to admit that. So here you are in a modern African country, and nobody wants to admit that they're from Tanzania or from the modern African country. They're so alienated that they seek their place of origin outside of the continent. Now, that's not a healthy thing for a country, is it?
No, it isn't. No,
So,
it isn't.
so we
But
need to have the conversation, and we need to do something that means that people who had that status do not feel that it destroys them. And there were people all over the continent, because I've had that conversation with different people in different countries. In Zimbabwe, somebody who had said, oh, their family had been looked after by David Livingstone and all of this stuff, because again, she didn't want to talk about it, but that was what was in her family and underlying. And then she said, they don't talk about it, but it's a big factor in what's going on in the region and the different ethnicities. So yeah, we need to talk about it. Status on this continent.
status, and on the other side of that, to get beyond the pain of, as you said, the indignity that continues to be done to some peoples across the African continent, the idea of affirmation. One of the ways that you have tried to find affirmation within Black culture in various places you have gone to has been through your filmmaking. Notably, you're one of the first directors to break through in a significant way at the BBC and be given some freedom to produce particularly documentary materials, and that's what was the interesting thing about it. It wasn't just fiction. I wondered what role you think filmmaking plays in the business of cultural restitution.
Oh, it's vital, and the young people are doing it. It's not just film now, because we have all these platforms. So, people are making short stuff on Twitter, and it's explosive now. So the narratives and the discussions are kind of out there. I mean, I was just amazed during the Black Lives Matter thing how much short history telling was going on about America particularly, and the impacts of and the legacies of slavery and structural racism. So there's a huge platform to do this. But on the film side, on a popular level, you know, sometimes people denigrate, popular stuff like the Black Panther, and
I was just going to say,
I'm like, the Black Panther got a lot of people to re-engage with Africa, the first one, who were in the diaspora, and to see and to affirm themselves in that, whereas before it was a source of shame and disgrace and everything else, and it was very positive. But the second one I just thought was amazing, because the second one had a discussion about the African Atlantic on a popular level, a very sophisticated conversation between how do you fix the impulse for revenge, but also the conversation, because the African Atlantic I've talked about, but there is also a native Atlantic. We've all been obsessed with the Euro-Atlantic, but there was a native Atlantic who they will find their voice and start that conversation. And in that second one, the Submariner, I mean, it was a native community, and they wanted that revenge too, because after Columbus arrives and the impact he had on their communities, they just wanted to wipe out, the Europeans, and the Africans were saying, no, 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 there's a better way to do this, and that was the discourse. How do you deal with imperialism and colonialism in that Atlantic space? So people are having very sophisticated conversations, even on a popular level, about these issues, and I think that part of the reason we're discussing the Atlantic space is because it's in decline and it's going. We don't know what the East will offer, but we're well positioned for that as well, because we share, they call it the Indian Ocean, perhaps it should be the African Ocean, but we share that ocean with the East as well. So obviously we share that conversation with Northeast Africa, which they call the Middle East, and we can have all those conversations with Asia. But You know, Chinese say when they want to curse you, that they wish you to live in interesting times. It's interesting times, and the globe is shifting, and we have choices to make, and our own internal coherence is important. How we deal with our issues of, you know, our own issues of inequality and equity and status, and which are very, very, very important. Um, and the impulse towards new dynasties. I'm glad the one in Gabon has just ended, because you know, I come from a tradition in Igbo land where we don't have kings and queens, so I have a very different attitude to all of this stuff.
I think you come pre-forged as a rebel, fresh from the womb, without the respect for hierarchy.
Yeah, our culture doesn't like hierarchy or unearned hierarchy. So we'll see where we all are.
So interesting times we're living in. Our great thanks to Onyekachi Wambu for that.
Thank you.
A big overview of where Africa is at in terms of its relation to its own history, its sense of itself, and what a model of the future for Africa might be. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for taking the time for the discussion. These are important discussions.
So thank you very much for joining us on Sunday night, where in a leafy corner of Accra, we've been talking to Onyekachi Wambu, the editor, filmmaker, and journalist, as well as thinker about African history and culture. And he's been telling us about what African countries can do to restore cultural artifacts taken away from them in the course of centuries, particularly the colonial era directly, and how to restore the integrity and the dignity of African peoples and the new thinking around that. Our great thanks to you for joining us again on Sunday night. Helping us produce this edition of Sunday Night has been George Watting on logistics. On camera and sound has been Gideon Sumwa. Our great thanks to him. And I've been your host, Nana Yaa Mensah. Join us again, same time next week for Sunday Night and more tales of this wonderful continent we call Africa.